celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The story we are told is that Jesus of Nazareth, around the age of 33, went down to Jerusalem with his disciples during the Pesach Festival, also known as the Passover, which is a Jewish festival celebrated at the Spring Equinox, which, according to tradition, occurs on the 14th of the Babylonian month of Nisan, which corresponds to the Athenian month of Eleuthibolia, which also corresponds to the period of the Roman March 15th to April 15th, which means that the 14th of Nisan would fall on the 28th of March, roughly. Although since the Julian Calendar is solar and the Babylonian and Attic Calendars are lunar, the dates will vary from year to year. This is also why the dates of Easter and Passover are celebrated on different days of our modern Gregorian calendars each year, and they mark the date of Easter and Pesach based on the Paschal Moon. The date of Easter is set as the Sunday following the Paschal full moon, which is the first full moon that occurs on or around March 21st. This date, March 21st, is designated as the ecclesiastical equinox by our current Gregorian calendar, serving as a standardized reference point for the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere. The term full moon here does not align with a specific astronomical event, but represents the 14th day of a lunar month, which is the 14th day of Nisan from the biblical tradition. This is due to the Babylonian calendar being lunar. They would add days to the year after the 12th month, Adar, to make up for the extra days, sometimes considered a 13th month, Adar 2, adjusting the lunar solar calendar to realign the new year, to start at a new moon. And 14 days later would be the first full moon, since the 1st of Nisan is the first day of the year. The 14th of Nisan is the first full Paschal moon. And this tradition predates the Jewish Passover and is actually deeply pagan, which is what I will show you in this video. The 14th of Nisan, the traditional date for the Passover, which according to the book of Exodus, it's recounted that Yahweh instructed Moses to command the Israelites to smear the blood of a lamb on their doorpost. This act was meant to ensure that the angel of death would skip over their homes, sparing them from the final plague, the death of the firstborn. Following this plague, Pharaoh demanded the Israelites depart, allowing them to take their possessions and requesting Moses' blessing in God's name. The narrative explains that the ritual of the Passover sacrifice commemorates the event when God passed over the Israelites dwelling in Egypt. But I will attempt to show that the lamb sacrifice ritual is much older than the Israelites and stretches back to ancient Babylonian and Assyrian festival rites of the Vernal Equinox. More on that later. In the New Testament, Jesus went down to Jerusalem during this Passover festival and was crucified by Pontius Pilate under the behest of the Jewish Sanhedrin and Pharisees and Sadducees, was put on a cross on a Friday morning, died at noon, was dead for 2 full days, and rose on the 3rd day, on Sunday, just after sunrise, according to Mark's Gospel. Since the consensus is that Mark's Gospel is the earliest of all the Gospels, older by a decade in some cases, let's take a look at what the account says.
It was 9 in the morning when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. It was Preparation Day, Friday. That is the day before the Sabbath.
The last chapter of Mark's Gospel, chapter 16, from the oldest Gospel, according to scholarly consensus, goes as follows.
When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, Sunday, after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Curtains closed. That is how the story ends. You might be surprised to hear, as I was, that this is how the oldest manuscripts of the Gospels actually end. Now, some of you who are Christians or grew up Christian probably already typing in the comments,
"No way! You left out the entire part when Jesus returns?"
The following passages are added by the church in manuscripts that date to past the 5th century and beyond. In those later manuscripts, the story continues after Mary Magdalene finds no body in the tomb.
When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. He said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people, and they will get well." After the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven, and he sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by the signs that accompanied it.
Those extra 11 passages are added after the 5th century. Even church fathers Jerome and Eusebius in the 4th and 5th centuries do not mention these 11 verses about Jesus after the resurrection. The following manuscripts are as follows.
All physical fragments and manuscripts before 300 AD only contain verses 1 through 8. Codex Vaticanus, 325 to 350 AD, only extant verses 1 through 8. Codex Sinaiticus, 330 to 360 AD, only extant verses 1 through 8. Then Codex Bezae, 400, complete, 1 through 20. Codex Alexandrinus, 400 to 440 AD, complete, 1 through 20. Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, 500 AD, complete, 1 through 20.
So it's not until after the 5th century when the church begins to add 11 verses to the Gospel of Mark that include any narrative about Jesus returning to his disciples after resurrection, the central event for Easter itself. But this is not actually the main topic of this video. The reason why I brought up the added verses about Jesus' resurrection is to highlight that the Gospels and the Christian tradition were not set in stone from day one. The tradition of Christianity developed over the course of many centuries. In fact, not only does Christianity develop over the course of 5 centuries after Jesus, I would also argue that the tradition of Christianity began long before Jesus. In this tradition of the Katabasis, the descent and return of the hero god, dying and rising gods of agriculture, which are celebrated at the same week as the Easter and Passover festivals, which is the Spring Equinox itself. The resurrection of life and the sun. I'm fully aware that many Bible scholars are allergic to the phrase, dying and rising God. Mainstream Bible scholars scoff at this concept and write it off as outdated mythicist concepts that were popular in the 19th and 20th centuries by scholars like James Frazer and Francis Dupuy, and they will claim that these ideas have been debunked. However, I and many others, especially classicists, people outside of biblical studies and seminarians, I'm not satisfied with this new dogma. The so-called quest for the historical Jesus scholarship that started with Albert Schweitzer, taken over by the likes of Bart Ehrman and others, have done a great job at highlighting many problems with Jesus mythicism, and I think they are right that it is very likely that historical Jesus of Nazareth absolutely existed. But what has never been done in any demonstration is that the category of Savior, sons and daughters of God who die and resurrect or descend into hell and return triumphantly don't exist. And not only do they exist, but they are deeply rooted in the culture of religious attitudes of the Mediterranean world and have deep influence over the festivals that are celebrated at the beginning of spring. I believe that the current state of biblical scholarship is in a bubble that needs to be popped. From Attis and Osiris, whose death and resurrections were celebrated at the Hilaria the week of March 25th, to Adonis during the Adonia Festival, the Great Dionysia, where Dionysus' dismemberment and resurrection were performed at plays in Athens during this very week, to even as far back as the Akitu festivals in Babylon that reenacted the sacred marriage between Tammuz and Ishtar, the savior goddess who descends into the underworld, dies for 3 days like Jesus, and reascends triumphantly over the forces of death, bringing the crops and the blossoming of trees and flowers with her and her husband Dumuzi. All of that, as well as the many more myths and festivals regarding the Katabasis, will be discussed in this video. The Spring Equinox, also known as the Vernal Equinox, marks the moment in the year when the sun crosses the celestial equator from south to north. This event occurs around March 20th or 21st in the northern hemisphere and around September 22nd or 23rd in the southern hemisphere, depending on the year. The term equinox comes from the Latin words meaning equal night, reflecting the approximately equal length of day and night that occurs everywhere on Earth during the equinoxes. The spring equinox signifies the beginning of spring, a time of renewal and growth when daylight begins to increase, leading to longer days than nights. It is a period celebrated in various cultures with festivals and rituals that often symbolize rebirth. For fertility and new beginnings. In the northern hemisphere, the spring equinox is associated with the warming weather, melting snow, budding plants, and the return of foliage and blooming flowers, embodying the cycle of life, rejuvenation, and the earth's fertility. Ancient spring equinox festivals were significant cultural and religious events in many ancient societies, marking the end of winter and the beginning of spring. These festivals were often tied to agricultural cycles, reflecting the importance of planting seasons and the growth of new life. Unlike our modern Gregorian calendars of today, which mark the new year on January 1st, in the middle of the winter, at the winter solstice, as the Romans passed down to us, there were many ancient cultures that started the New Year's at the spring equinox, and there also were others who marked the New Year at midsummer solstice, such as the Egyptians, and even the Greeks started their New Year at the fall equinox during the harvest time. Sumer, Babylon, Assyria, and the Persians started the New Year at the spring equinox. This was adopted by the Jews, who also adopted the Babylonian and Persian lunar calendars. The Babylonians, Assyrians, and Jews called this month Nisan, and the Persians and Elamites called this month Adukhanisa. The Akitu Festival, one of the oldest religious festivals in recorded history, if not the oldest, was celebrated at the spring equinox, originating in the 3rd millennium BCE. It was a significant celebration for the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia, marking the planting of barley in early spring around March-April. On the Babylonian calendar, this is called Nisanu. This period heralded the new year. The Babylonians referred to it as the beginning of the year, Resh Shatim. During the early dynastic period, each Sumerian city-state celebrated its own festivals to honor its patron deity. This tradition persisted into Akkadian period in the 3rd millennium BCE, with a broader scope extending across Sumer to venerate the supreme deities of Akkad, Anu, Enlil, and Enki along Ishtar, originating as the Sumerian goddess Inanna. Among the most ancient ceremonies were those dedicated to Tammuz, or Dumuzi, an agricultural barley, grain, and vine deity symbolizing death and rebirth, whose rituals often involved elaborate mourning practices. These rites depict Dumuzi's death and resurrection, symbolizing the cycle of fertility and abundance. These celebrations maintain the foundational aims established by early Sumerian traditions to pay homage to the divine, affirm the sovereignty of the monarch, and foster a shared sense of faith and communal practice among the populace. This multifaceted celebration took place in 2 key locations. In Babylon, the Esagila Temple, dedicated to the supreme deity Marduk, and the House of the New Year, situated to the city's north. Central to the festivals were Nabu and his father Marduk, who was later synced with Tammuz, often called Bel, or Lord, in the 1st millennium BCE, as Marduk's name was deemed too sacred for regular utterance. Marduk would usurp Enlil's role as the king of the gods, and his mythologies are spread into many different gods who also take on traits of Tammuz, such as Bel Sarbi, lord of the poplar tree, Dumuzi Amashgalana, lord of the date palm, Ningishita, lord of the tree, sometimes seen as a chthonic twin of Tammuz, and Damu, the divine child. All of these being tree gods, vine gods, or gods of some type of vegetation, but Bel, or Lord, would end up as the syncretic deity that the Assyrians and Babylonians would spread to the west, who would go on to influence Semitic Baal and Adonis, who had major temples all throughout Syria, Phoenicia, and Judea. In the Baal cycle, a text that dates to 1500 BCE, in the Bronze Age, Baal is the son of El, the highest god, Elyon. Baal's death is announced to El and El mourns for him. Mourning rites by El in the Knot, also equated with Ishtar, Baal's sister and consort. Just like Dumuzi, their mourning rites are described in detail. Later in the text, El has a dream that oil and honey rain down to restore the richness of the earth, a symbol of agriculture, which he believes is informing him that Baal has returned to life. Finally, Baal is seen riding in the clouds, and a description of his return to his throne is described. Once again, El, being the same name as the God of the Hebrew Bible, has a son who dies, resurrects, and is mourned over by women. Tammuz was named for the month of midsummer, when the crops are full and the sun is at its high point. But his death and resurrection were celebrated at the spring, when the crops returned from the underworld, and the fertility of Ishtar, the dawn goddess, saves all mankind from the death of winter. There are two versions of this story. One of them is found in Nergal and Ereshkigal, and the other is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. They both involve Ishtar, or Inanna, as the savior goddess of dawn, represented by the planet Venus, the star that is visible during the time of dawn when all the other planets and stars are no longer visible. In Nergal and Ereshkigal, the version of the descent of Ishtar, Tammuz is slain. Ishtar mourns over the death of Tammuz. Then she descends into Kernugi, the underworld, revives his corpse, and brings him back to the land of the living. And upon his resurrection, the dead are raised with him, and the crops and trees blossom and bring spring and warmth to the world.
He has gone to the bosom of the earth, and the dead are numerous in the land. Men are filled with sorrow, they stagger by day in gloom. In the month of thy year, which brings not peace, hast thou gone. Thou hast gone on a journey that makes an end of thy people. The Holy One of Ishtar, in the middle of the year the fields languish. The shepherd, the wise one, the man of sorrows, why have they slain? In his temple, in his inhabited domain, the child, Lord of knowledge, abides no more. In the meadows, verily, verily, the soul of life perishes. The welling is for the herbs. The first lament is, they are not produced. The welling is for the grain. Ears are not produced. The welling is for the habitations, for the flocks which bring forth no more. The welling is for the perishing wedded ones, for the perishing children. The dark-headed people create no more.
Ishtar mourns over the death of her lover, the shepherd god of agriculture, Tammuz. She then decides to descend into the land of no return, to face her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld. Ishtar, when she arrived at the gates of Kernugi, Hades, addressed the gatekeeper.
I shall raise up the dead, and they shall outnumber the living.
In order to save him, she must descend through 7 gates of the underworld and remove 7 articles of clothing until she is naked, and then must face the judgment of Ereshkigal and ask her to return her lover Tammuz from death. Enki, the creator and god of wisdom, the Sumerian Prometheus, creates a trickster plot to help her succeed in her mission to resurrect the dead.
Enki, in the wisdom of his heart, created a person. He created the good looks playboy. Come, good looks the playboy, set your face toward the gates of Kernugi. The 7 gates of Kernugi shall be opened before you. Ereshkigal, the queen of Hades, shall look at you and be glad to see you. When she is relaxed, her mood will lighten. Get her to swear the oath by the great gods, Anunnaki. Raise your head, pay attention to the water of life, saying, Hey, my lady, let them give me the water skin that I may drink from it.
Now I want you to remember the good looks playboy for later in this video, because I think this can possibly be influential to the descent of Orpheus to Hades. More on that later. As a result of Enki's plan and Ishtar's descent, all goes well, and the plan is successful. Ishtar is brought in before the Anunnaki. She is sprinkled with the waters of life and ascends back up through the 7 gates of Hades, called Kernugi. Ereshkigal then addresses the Anunnaki and says,
"Bring the Anunnaki out and seat them on golden thrones. Sprinkle Ishtar with the waters of life and conduct her in my presence." Ishtar was sprinkled with the waters of life and brought to her sister. She was led out through the first gate and given back the garment of her body. She was led out through the second gate and given the bangles of her wrists and ankles. Through the third gate, she was given her girdle and stones around her waist. Through the fourth gate, her toggle pins and breastplate. Fifth gate, beads around her neck. Sixth gate, rings for her ears. Seventh gate, her great crown for her head. Swear that she has paid her ransom and give her back Dumuzi, Tammuz, the lover of her youth. Wash him with pure water, anoint him with sweet oil, clothe him in a purple robe. Let the lapis lazuli pipe play. Let the women raise a loud lament. On the day when Dumuzi, Tammuz, comes back up, and the lapis lazuli pipe and the carnelian ring came up with him, when male and female mourners come up with him, the dead shall come up and smell the smoke offering. Descent of Ishtar to the underworld.
Not only is Tammuz raised from the dead, but he is also anointed in this text, which is what the word Christ actually means. According to Samuel Noah Kramer, a Syriologist and historian who has translated more Sumerian texts than anyone in world history, says that by the late 3rd millennium BCE, Uruk's rulers affirmed their authority through embodying Tammuz or Dumuzi during a sacred marriage rite. This ceremony, part of the Akitu Festival, marking the Sumerian New Year, occurred on its 10th day, which would fall exactly on the 14th of Nisan, the day that Jesus Christ was crucified, and they would perform a ritual marriage between Dumuzi and Ishtar to mark the Spring Equinox and New Year.
My vulva, the horn, the boat of heaven, is full of eagerness like the young moon. My untilled land lies fallow. As for me, Inanna, who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my high field? Who will plow my wet ground? As for me, the young woman, who will plow my vulva? Who will station the ox there? Who will plow my vulva? Make your milk sweet and thick, my bridegroom. My shepherd, I will drink your fresh milk. Wild bull, Dumuzi, make your milk sweet and thick. I will drink your fresh milk. Let the milk of the goat flow in my sheepfold. Fill my holy churn with honey cheese. Lord Dumuzi, I will drink your fresh milk.
In that particular passage, Ishtar is weeping for Tammuz, and this weeping for Tammuz is a ritual we see all across the Mediterranean and Near East in different cultures for mourning rituals for different gods. In the Gilgamesh version of the Descent of Ishtar, Tammuz is not the god who dies and rises again. It is Ishtar, called Inanna, who goes into Hades alone after the bowl of heaven is slain by Gilgamesh, and Inanna, who calls this bowl of heaven her husband, just like Tammuz. And Tammuz is also called a bull and is depicted with horns. But in this text, Gugulana is the bull and husband of Inanna, which is very confusing, but shows that there's obviously a connection to the death of Tammuz. Inanna descends into the land of the dead to save him, and she is hung and transfixed on the eye of death, almost like a crucifixion, is dead for 3 days, and then resurrects.
From the great above, Inanna opened her ear to the great below. Because of my older sister Ereshkigal, her husband Gugulana, the bull of heaven, has died. I have come to witness the funeral rites, Ishtar says. Quiet, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. Ereshkigal, queen of Hades, responds to her sister Ishtar The Anunnaki, the judges of the underworld, surrounded her. They passed judgment against her. Then Ereshkigal fastened on Inanna the eye of death. She spoke against her the word of wrath. She uttered against her the cry of guilt. She struck her. Inanna was turned into a corpse, a piece of rotting meat, and was hung from a hook on the wall.
Similar to Jesus, the text specifically states that Ishtar is dead for 3 days and 3 nights.
When, after 3 days and 3 nights, Inanna had not returned, Ninshubur set up a lament for her by the ruins. She beat the drum for her in the temple. She circled the houses of the gods. She tore at her eyes. She tore at her mouth. She tore at her thighs. She dressed herself in a single garment like a beggar. Alone, she set out for Nippur and the temple of Enlil.
Once again, it is Enki who saves the day, Inanna's father god Enki, who creates 2 Gala, 2 unique beings created neither male or female, to aid her in returning to Earth. The Gala enter the underworld like flies, and following Enki's specific instructions, attach themselves closely to Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead, is seen in distress.
From under his fingernail, Father Enki brought forth dirt. He fashioned the dirt into Kurgara, a creature neither male nor female. From under the fingernail of his other hand, he brought forth dirt. He fashioned the dirt into a Galatur, a creature neither male nor female. He gave the food of life to the Kurgara. He gave the water of life to the Galatur. Enki spoke to the Kurgara and Galatur, saying, "Go to the underworld. Enter the door like flies." Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, is moaning. Ask her only for the corpse that hangs from the hook on the wall. One of you will sprinkle the food of life on it. The other will sprinkle the water of life. Inanna will rise. The Kurgara and the Galatur heeded Enki's words. They set out for the underworld. Like flies, they slipped through the cracks of the gates. They entered the throne room of the queen of the underworld.
It is the 3rd day that Ishtar is raised from the dead, as Enki, who is God the Father, sends down his angels, the Gali, to raise up the savior goddess Ishtar from the dead, and she is raised up from the dead, and the dead are raised with her.
Ereshkigal said, "Speak then, what do you wish?" They answered, "We wish only the corpse that hangs from the hook on the wall." Ereshkigal said, "The corpse belongs to Inanna." They said, "Whether it belongs to our queen, whether it belongs to our king, that is what we wish." The corpse was given to them. The Kurgara sprinkled the food of life on the corpse. The Galatur sprinkled the water of life on the corpse. Inanna arose.
As Ishtar is raised up, the crops and trees are also raised up. Her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of heaven, tells Ishtar that someone will need to take her place. But there is a twist in this version. When she arrives back at the land of living, she sees her lover Tammuz seated on a throne, wearing fine garments, anointing himself with oil, and drinking wine with temple prostitutes. She notices that he is not properly mourning her death. She is furious and decides to make a deal with her sister that she would allow for Tammuz to take her place for half the year in the underworld, while Ningishita would serve in her spot for the other 6 months. This 6-month system of returning to Hades, which causes the seasons to change, is later reflected in several other myths, such as with Adonis and Persephone, who take turns every 6 months in Hades, but I will speak more on that later. There is a book called Esther in the Hebrew Bible, in the Greek Septuagint, wide-ranging in versions and manuscript traditions, but all about a Jewish queen named Esther, pronounced Esther in Hebrew, who lived in the Persian court of Xerxes along with Mordecai, who in Hebrew is Mardoki, and Mardochaeus in Greek. Notice the names Esther and Mardoki. which some scholars and myself have noticed sounds a lot like Marduk and Ishtar. In the longest extant version of the Book of Esther from the Septuagint, preserved in the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, and otherwise considered apocryphal, the story seems to align very much with the descent of Ishtar. Marduk is in trouble in the court of Xerxes and is about to be slain due to Haman, one of the members of the court who plotted against Marduk. In chapter 4, Esther, like Ishtar, ritually mourns for 3 days from Marduk. And for the people of Israel, due to the situation they are under, being in a diaspora, the text reads,
"And all Israel cried with all their might, for the death was before their eyes. And Queen Esther betook herself for refuge to the Lord, being taken as it were in the agony of death. And having taken off her glorious apparel, she put on garments of distress and mourning. And instead of grand perfumes, she filled her head with ashes and dung. She greatly brought down her body, and she filled every place of her gland, adorning with the torn curls of her hair." Esther 4:18.
We see a similar tearing and ash-covering mourning rite being taken up by Ishtar for Dumuzi in Akkadian texts.
"Why have you covered your head with a cloth? You who are a shepherd, how you walk about. Holy Ishtar weeps bitterly in her house, which having descended from heaven stands on the earth. She wears sackcloth and ashes, rips out her hair, tears her torn sinews, rips out her hair, plucks out her hair like burr rushes. The lady wept at the meaning of the decreed fate. Dumuzi wept at the meaning of the decreed fate. The mourning for Dumuzi."
The apocryphal manuscripts also have a similar plot as the descent of Ishtar, in which Esther is attended by eunuchs, just as Ishtar was attended by the Gali, who are also eunuchs. Esther then descends through multiple portals in the palace until she is finally brought into the chamber of the king, where she puts on a royal attire, and like Ishtar, finds favor with the queen of Hades. Esther finds favor with King Xerxes.
On the third day, putting an end to her prayers, she took off her penitential garments and arrayed herself in royal attire. In making her state appearance, after invoking the all-seeing God and Savior, she took her 2 eunuchs. On the one she leaned gently for support, while the other followed her bearing her train. She glowed with the perfection of her beauty, and her countenance was joyous as it was lovely, though her heart was shrunk with fear. She passed through all the portals till she stood face to face with the king, who was seated on his royal throne, clothed in full robes of state, and covered with gold and precious stones.
Esther is able to sway the king to release Mordecai, and she saves all the Israelites from persecution. Mordecai is then given a purple robe and diadem that Haman wore before him, and Haman was then sentenced to die. The descent of Ishtar also has Tammuz robed in purple and sitting on a throne towards the end. Also, in the epilogue, Marduk relates that he had a dream about 2 dragons and a spring turning into a river and the light of the sun. He figures out that the river is Esther and the sun is the king, while the 2 dragons represent Marduk and Haman. It seems obvious to me, and many other scholars in the past have also concluded, that the book of Esther is drawing heavily from the myths of Ishtar's descent to the underworld to save Tammuz, the god who by the Hellenistic era was synced with Marduk, called Bel, and had many temples in Syria, Phoenicia, and the Levant, and was known by the names Baal and Adonis. If the names Marduk and Esther aren't enough to see the relations of Marduk and Ishtar, the story has these elements in common. Both Esther and Ishtar mourn for someone. They're both wearing sackcloth and ashes. They're both attended by eunuchs. They both seek deliverance from a god. They both descend through portals or gates. They both go face to face with the king or queen. They both find favor with king or queen. They both save someone from death. and that person that's saved from death is replaced by someone else. Another thing to note is that the festival of Purim, which commemorates the events of Ishtar, is celebrated at the 14th of Adar, which corresponds to mid-March, and is celebrated on March 23rd of 2024. I also think one can argue that Lent could very well have some of its roots in the rites of mourning, as the sources suggest that Lent could have multiple rites from several traditions synced together in the 4th century into what we know today as Lent, using the symbolic 40 days and 40 nights from Jesus in the desert. But as we shall see in the remainder of this video, ritual mourning before the spring is something that appears to be universal. Weeping for Tammuz was a rite that was well known in Israel, as Ezekiel states.
Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and I saw women sitting there, mourning the god Tammuz. Ezekiel 8:14.
Ritual mourning for the dead gods of agriculture was abundant in the ancient world. And just as Purim leads into Passover, the Akitu Festival was kicked off on the 4th of Nisan, 10 days before the Spring Equinox, with the high priest of Esagila declaring the New Year's start, initiating a week-long public holiday. The king participated by visiting Nabu's temple to receive the royal scepter from the high priest, following an overnight stay in Borsippa, home to renowned Nabu temple. Concurrently, the creation epic Enuma Elish was recited in the house of the New Year. Upon the king's return to Babylon on the 5th of Nisan, accompanied by Nabu's statue, a series of humble and symbolic acts were performed before Marduk, including the king being struck on the cheek as a ritualistic act of penance. Following this, a hopeful oracle for the future was received, and the king's insignia were returned. The following days saw various gods' statues, including Nabu's, engaging in symbolic battles and rituals, culminating in a grand display to the public on the 8th of Nisan. This peak moment involved all deities coming together to affirm their guidance for the coming year, reminiscent of a modern State of the Union address, always promising prosperity and success. The festivities included processions through the city to the river, where the gods embarked on a journey to the house of the New Year, where the king personally escorted Marduk. Songs and hymns and various themes were sung, celebrating Ishtar, humorously degrading Enlil, and questioning the gods' absence from their temples, to which they replied their need to be with Marduk. While the specific activities in the house of the New Year on the 9th and 10th of Nisan remain a mystery, it is believed that sacrifices were made, possibly human sacrifice as well, and war spoils presented to the gods. The festivals concluded with the gods' return to Esagila, reiterating their annual policy before bidding Nabu farewell and dispersing. The Akitu Festival endured for many centuries beyond Babylon, with celebrations in places like Palmyra and Emesa and Syria, and even being introduced to Italy by the Roman Emperor Elagabalus in the 3rd century of the Common Era. During the Severan dynasty, Eastern religious influence began to take its course throughout the Roman Empire. Another ancient festival celebrated at the Spring Equinox is the Zukru Festival of the Assyrians. The Assyrians have two major festivals celebrated at opposite times of the year: the Kisu Festival, celebrated at the same time as the Hebrew Sukkot, the Fall Equinox, and the Zukru Festival was celebrated on the same day as Passover, the 14th of Nisan, which is the 14th day of the New Year, the Spring Equinox. These two equinox festivals are the largest and most documented in the Assyrian tablets dug up at Nineveh. Arnaud Daniel, famous Assyriologist who has written extensively on this subject, has proposed that these festivals are a commemoration of the gods and goddesses' descent to the underworld and later resurrection. The rite of laying down the statue of Ninkur was a symbolic gesture of the burial of the goddess. The presence of the mourning woman figures and rites of mourning also gives much credence to this theory as well. At the Zukru Festival at Nineveh, sacred to the god Dagon, which, according to the tablets found at Nineveh, was celebrated on, drumroll please, the 14th day of Nisan, where the text actually reads on the 14th day of the new year, which coincides to Nisan 14, which is the same day as the Passover and the same day Jesus was crucified. 70 unblemished lambs were sacrificed for this festival. Unblemished lambs is exactly what the tablets specifically call for, and 70 total, which is a number that anyone who knows about Passover will think I'm lying about, because during the 7-day Passover festival, 7 lambs are slaughtered. The unblemished lamb sacrifice is what is in Deuteronomy. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of this first month. On the 15th day of that month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days present a food offering to the Lord, and on the 7th day, hold a sacred assembly and do no work.
On the day you wave the sheaf, you must sacrifice as a burnt offering to the Lord an unblemished lamb without any defect. Moses.
I'm sorry, Moses, but I'm pretty sure that you did not get this command from Yahweh. Here's what the Nineveh tablets say about Zukru on the exact same day and the exact same week. The first offerings of Zukru Festival are sacrificed on the 14th of the month, the head of the year. It says, on the 14th day, they offer 70 unblemished lambs provided by the king. For all 70 gods, the 70 lambs are to be sacrificed to each of the 70 gods of Amar. And another text prescribes that 70 doves be distributed between them. You can find the same primary sources that I found from these 2 peer-reviewed articles and 1 book. One is the 70 bowls sacrificed at Sukkot by Noga Ayala Darshan, Department of Hebrew and Semitic Languages at Bar Ilan University, Israel, and the other is the god Dagon in Bronze Age Syria by Louis Feliu. They are the ones who translated these. So not only do we have festivals of Zukru celebrated on the same exact day as Passover for the same 7-day duration of Passover, but both Passover and Zukru call for the sacrifice of a single unblemished lamb for each god, and one for Yahweh, one for each of the 70 gods of Nineveh. But this also means that Jesus, as the lamb sacrifice, has his origins in a pagan Assyrian religion. The Dagon of the garden is an epithet of Dagon that is venerated at Zukru. This also gives more plausibility to the interpretation by Assyriologist Arnaud Daniel that this festival was one that was related to the death and resurrection of gods of agriculture. Also, just as Passover is deeply linked to the Sukkot at the fall equinox, the Zukru is deeply tied to the Akitu Festival at the fall equinox. Both the Hebrew Sukkot and the Assyrian Akitu are 7 days long, and they both call for the sacrifice of exactly 70 bulls, a connection that is too specific to be coincidence. 70 lambs sacrificed at the Zukru and 70 bulls at the Akitu are representative of the 70 gods who serve under Dagon. In the book of Enoch, there were 70 shepherds slaughtered as a prophecy for 70 prophets who will be martyred before the coming of the Messiah. There are also 70 disciples of Jesus who preach the word about the kingdom of heaven and become martyrs for Christ. Enoch's fallen angels are also symbolic for the fallen gods of the pagan world who serve the interest against Israel. The number 70 is abundant in the ancient world in many sources throughout the Hebrew Bible and Christian texts. Following Arnaud's seasonal resurrection interpretation for the agricultural gods at the Zukru, the underworld part would be personified by deities such as Suala and Rashab. The Zukru ritual of lying down the statue of Ninkor in the temple of Dagon looks like a sacred marriage rite between the divine couple, similar to Ishtar and Tammuz, or Adonis and Venus. Professor Arnaud strengthens his argument for the existence of gods who die and rise by means of the collection of names, as there are theophoric names with the element Yamut, which, according to Professor Arnaud, in principle, may be related to a Syrian word, mot, which means to die. For all these reasons, it is possible to connect the Kisu ritual with some kind of rite related to the commemoration and the remembrance of the marriage of the divine couple, Dagon and Ninkor, which then begs the question, where does the unleavened bread come in? And is this truly special for Israelites and the Exodus? And to this I would say no. Here's why. We have a badly damaged papyrus dating to the year 419 BCE, long after the so-called Exodus, and even long after the Israelites have returned from Babylonian captivity. It's in Aramaic, and it's from Jews living in Jerusalem, writing to the Jews living in Elephantine. It is known by scholars as the Passover Papyrus from Elephantine. The letter states that King Darius II has instructed the Persian satrap Armasis to allow the Jewish garrison at Elephantine to observe a 7-day festival of unleavened bread. This is believed to be an early reference to observe the Passover holiday. However, there is no mention of the word Passover, and there's nothing about an Exodus. In fact, in all of the hundreds of fragments and papyri and etched tablets found at Elephantine, there was not a single mention of an Exodus or Passover. And keep in mind, this is 1,000 years after the Exodus. So what gives? Why are they celebrating a 7-day festival of unleavened bread with ritual sacrifices of unblemished lambs? Now, as we have already demonstrated in the last 5 minutes of this video, a 7-day festival initiated on the same day, the 14th of Nisan, with ritual unblemished lamb sacrifices, is already established long before Israel. And I think the answer of where the unleavened bread part comes in from the next major festival that I'm about to talk about. Notice how the letter mentions that it is Darius, a Persian king, who is allowing this festival to take place, and it's Assyrians who were already doing the Spring Festival. So could it be that the Persians themselves celebrated this festival? Nowruz, originating in ancient Persia, modern-day Iran, and surrounding regions, also celebrated on the Spring Equinox. It symbolizes rebirth and renewal, and customs including the cleaning of homes, spring cleaning, the setting of the Hothseen table, which includes 7 items, starting with the letter S in Persian, each symbolizing a different hope for the new year, and the sharing of special meals. Nowruz has been celebrated for over 3,000 years and continues to be observed by millions of people around the world. At the table of Nowruz, boiled eggs are painted and then added to the table as a decoration. Passover has an egg on the Seder plate, and Easter, of course, has colored eggs as a strong and important holiday symbol. This rite is also observed by ancient Egyptians, as Professor Asante points out, African historian and philosopher. This practice of coloring eggs at the spring equinox goes back thousands of years in Egypt as well. More on that later. But the Persians also were known for making flatbreads and unleavened bread and serving them at Nowruz Festival. You are looking at the kuku sabzi, Persian mixed herb frittata, a traditional Nowruz meal that goes back to the Persian Empire in the time of Darius, the same Darius who was in that papyrus. The green and red colors, meze spread, wrapped up in a flat, unleavened bread with slices of tomato, because the green and red colors are traditional festival colors of the Persians, which is also why they decorate with green and red during the winter solstice festivals too. It seems likely to me that the unleavened bread is a Persian-era addition to the Hebrew Israelite tradition, and the entire Exodus story is a later Hellenistic era story that the Israelites wrote to form national mythology. The Persians are also culturally close to Eastern European and Black Sea region Armenians and Cappadocians, which also influence much of Eastern Europe throughout antiquity and Middle Ages. It is very likely that the rites of coloring eggs finds its roots deep in this part of the world. Eostre, the spring goddess of the Germanic people, who many think is connected with Ishtar, which is only somewhat true, but not for the reason people think. Eostre and Ishtar do sound similar, but Eostre is Indo-European, cognate with Eos from Indo-European Hesos. Ishtar, on the other hand, linguists say is Semitic, which is an Afro-Asiatic language and has very little overlap, if any at all, to the Indo-European languages. They are both dawn goddesses, both deeply connected to the month of April, and both represented by the planet Venus. Both female goddesses of love, beauty, and fertility. In fact, Tacitus, when describing the religion of the Germans, says that they worship Isis, a goddess who is deeply connected with Ishtar, who I will address next. Even if these two goddesses, Eostre and Ishtar, did not originate from the same linguistic source, it is true that both goddesses can easily be equivocated by the culture. Eostre is in fact the origin for the name Easter, the title we use for the Sunday of Jesus' resurrection. This is a fact that you can take to the bank. It starts with the text from Bede in 725 AD. Before that, the Greeks and Latins called it the Pascha, but the Anglo-Saxon and Germanic folk called it Eostermonath. Bede writes, Eostermonath has a name which is now translated Paschal Month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honor feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate the Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance, Bede, the reckoning of time. So yes, the name of Easter does in fact come from the name of a dawn goddess who is culturally connected to Ishtar, if not linguistically. By the 8th century AD, when Bede is writing this, Eostre is culturally connected to Venus Aphrodite, or Isis as Tacitus relates, who in turn is connected to Ishtar. And yes, coloring Easter eggs is a pagan rite performed by Persians, Egyptians, and Europeans. Tell that to your local seminary and scholar. Does this mean that Christians are secret pagans worshipping a dawn goddess? No. But it does reflect on the cultural milieu being like liquids that blend into each other, influencing each other for eternity. Even when one culture rejects another or even despises it, they will still influence each other, the same way Marvel Comics influence DC Comics and vice versa, even though they compete. The dawn goddess, Eostre, is equated by Tacitus to Isis, the Egyptian mother goddess of the divine child Horus, and consort to the dying and rising Osiris.
Of the gods, they give a special worship to Mercury, to whom on certain days they count even the sacrifice of human life lawful. To Hercules and Mars they appease with such animal life as is permissible. Many tribes of the Suebi perform sacrifices also to Isis. The cause and origin of this foreign worship I have not succeeded in discovering, except that the emblem itself, which takes the shape of a Liburnian galley, shows that the ritual is imported. Tacitus, Germania 9.
The Isis of the Suebi is most likely referring to Eostre, the dawn goddess, but Tacitus confusing a dawn goddess venerating at the spring equinox for Isis is not without any reason. Sham al-Nassim is an ancient Egyptian festival that heralds the beginning of spring. Its name translates to smelling the breeze in Arabic, and it is celebrated on the Monday following Orthodox Easter, though its origins predate both Christianity and Islam, rooting it deeply in Egyptians' pharaonic past. The festival origins can be traced back to at least 2700 BCE, during Egypt's Old Kingdom. It was originally connected to the agricultural and lunar cycles, celebrating Isis, the fertility goddess, and the flooding of the Nile plains, and the rebirth of life in the spring. The festival was known as Shemu in ancient times, which means renewal of life. The celebration was intertwined with the worship of gods and goddesses associated with creation and fertility. Shesmu, a Christ-like god of anointing, oils, perfumes, frankincense, and myrrh. Egyptians used red wine to symbolize the blood of Shesmu in religious offerings, similar to the Greeks' association with Dionysus and wine, and he was linked with Osiris, in some cases as an avatar of Osiris, as being a god of vegetation and moisture. In a pyramid text from the 21st dynasty between 1077 and 943 BCE, illustrations show Shesmu's wine press being loaded with human heads instead of grapes, a motif that was also prevalent in the coffin text of the Middle Kingdom. Subsequently, in the 26th dynasty, there's a sarcophagus of Agnes Neferbre, princess who lived between 597 and 525 BCE, who held the title of the wife of the god Ammon. On his sarcophagus, Shesmu Osiris is described as an exceptional oil producer for the deity Amun-Ra. Moving forward into the Egyptian Greco-Roman period, Shesmu became primarily associated with Dionysus in crafting exquisite oils and perfumes dedicated to the gods. Both Dionysus and Shesmu, as well as Osiris, are described as gods who are dismembered, died, and resurrect. Both Herodotus and Diodorus of Sicily equate Dionysus with Osiris and claim they are the same god.
For no gods are worshipped by all Egyptians in common except Isis and Osiris, who they say is Dionysus. These are worshipped by all alike. Osiris is, in the Greek language, Dionysus. Herodotus, 450 BCE.
In the Hellenistic period, Osiris and Dionysus are seen hyphenated as Dionysus Osiris, whom many say is the god Serapis. All three, Osiris, Dionysus, and Serapis, are tied to the Apis bull, the slain solar calf, and Isis is seen hyphenated with several goddesses such as Isis Aphrodite, Isis Cybele, Isis Demeter, Isis Persephone. Persephone, like Ishtar, is said to have gone to Hades, being taken down by Pluto against her will. But due to Demeter's will, she is able to return at spring to the land of the living for 6 months each year, and trades places with Adonis, the lover of Aphrodite. All three of those goddesses are linked to Isis. Thus, the traditions of the Katabasis, which is the descent and return from Hades, deeply embedded in Hellenistic religious culture, connected to all mythologies. The connection between Sham al-Nassim, or the Spring Festival, and these deities revolves around the themes of resurrection, renewal, and the triumph of life over death. The festival symbolizes the victory of Horus over Set, reflecting the eternal struggle between good and evil, and the rebirth of Osiris symbolizes the renewal of life, which is the essence of the spring celebration. The festival is closely linked to the mythology of Osiris and Horus, central figures in the Egyptian religion. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, the underworld, and rebirth, was murdered by his brother Set out of jealousy. Osiris's wife Isis, together with her sister Nephthys, gathered his dismembered body and resurrected him, leading to the association with cyclical renewal of life, death, and fertility. Osiris dies and is buried when the sown grain is hidden in the ground, and resurrects again when there is a beginning of sprouting at spring. A text that is contemporary with the Gospels by Plutarch has this to say about Osiris.
Osiris is being buried at the time when the grain is sown and covered in the earth, and then resurrects when plants begin to sprout. For this reason also, it is said that Isis, when she perceived that she became pregnant on the 6th day of the month of Phaeophi, and she gave birth to Harpocrates about the time of the winter solstice, imperfect and premature, amid the early flowers and shoots. For this reason, they bring to him as an offering the first fruits of growing lentils, and the days of his birth they celebrate after the spring equinox. Plutarch on Isis and Osiris.
Some might protest this and say that Plutarch is writing this in the early 2nd century. So how do we know he's not following a trend set by the Christians themselves? Well, sorry to burst your bubble here, but a pyramid text from the 24th century BC, 24 centuries before Christ, reads, "Raise yourself, Osiris the king, you firstborn son of Geb, at whom the great Aeneid tremble. May you be pure at the monthly festival. May you manifest at the new moon. May the 3-day festival be celebrated for you." This new moon lines up perfectly with the Paschal Moon of the Spring Equinox. Harpocrates, also called Horus, is the son of Osiris and Isis, representing the living pharaoh, and was associated with the sun, war, and hunting. Horus, as Plutarch relates, is born at the winter solstice, and his father Osiris is killed by Set and resurrects at the same time as Easter, the spring, predating Jesus in this. In the Hellenistic era, he shares this resurrection celebration with the god Adonis. More on that to come. But is also synced with Adonis, and known by the Greeks as the god Ion. The Neoplatonists, such as Porphyry and Iamblichus, say that Ion is Osiris Adonis hyphenated, which, as we have already mentioned, Adonis is deeply connected to Tammuz. More on that later. Traditionally, Egyptian Sham al-Nassim was known in Roman times as Hilaria, or the Serapia, and was celebrated by spending the day outdoors, picnicking in parks, beside the Nile, or in other natural settings, to enjoy the fresh spring air, smelling the breeze. The celebration includes specific foods that have been associated with the festival for thousands of years, such as salted and fermented fish, which dates back to ancient times and is thought to symbolize fertility and rebirth. Eating fish is also something that many Christians do on Good Friday, as they say Jesus ate fish on this day. But it is noteworthy that this was common for Egyptians to do at the Spring Resurrection Festival for Osiris. Also, symbolizing fertility, these are eaten for good fortune, representing life and rebirth, a custom that predates the the Christian Easter egg.
On that day, the modern Egyptians say that lettuce represents hopefulness at the beginning of the spring. Eggs are used to represent the renewal of life in the season of the spring. People dye the eggs in various colors in a tradition that goes back to the ancient Egyptians, who were probably the first to introduce this practice. Salted fish represents fertility and welfare.
Sham al-Nassim is still a national holiday in Egypt, celebrated by people of all religions, reflecting the country's rich tapestry of cultural and religious histories. It's a day that emphasizes unity, joy, and the appreciation of nature, bridging the ancient past with modern traditions in a celebration that has endured for millennia. Sham al-Nassim is not just a spring festival, but a profound reflection of Egypt's ancient civilization, its religious beliefs, and its cultural continuity, deeply embedded in the social fabric of the country, transcending religious lines and celebrating the universal themes of life, renewal, and harmony with nature. Shezmu's relationship with Osiris is primarily rooted in the context of the afterlife and the underworld, which is a central aspect of the Egyptians' religious beliefs. Osiris, as the god of the afterlife and resurrection, presides over the domain where Shezmu also operates. In funerary texts, Shezmu is often depicted as serving Osiris by using his skills to produce fine oils and perfumes for the gods, or to prepare the bodies of the dead for their journey in the afterlife. His role in pressing the blood of grapes into wine is symbolically linked to the transformation process within the underworld, reflecting the themes of death leading to rebirth, which are central to the cult of Osiris. The connection between Shezmu and Tammuz is less direct, as they hail from different mythological traditions, Egyptian and Mesopotamian respectively. However, both deities are linked to the themes of death and rebirth through their associations with vegetation and the cyclical nature of life. Tammuz's death and descent into the underworld, followed by his return, symbolizes the seasonal cycle of the earth's fertility, a theme that resonates with Shezmu's role in the production of life-sustaining substances and his involvement in the cycle of death and rebirth in the Egyptian underworld. The link between Osiris Shezmu and Tammuz can be found in the lands between them, Canaan. Eshmun is a healing god from Phoenician and Canaanite mythology, often associated with medicine and health. Like Shezmu and Tammuz, Eshmun is also connected to the themes of life and death. However, his primary aspect is a god of healing and restoration, and was considered to be the Asclepius of Beirut. By Byzantine historian Damascius, the link between Shezmu and Eshmun is more thematic than direct, as both are oil deities that can be seen as agents of transformation. Shezmu through the alchemical processes of creation and destruction, and Eshmun through the restoration of health and life. While they operate in different pantheons, cultural contexts, the underlying motifs of life, death, and resurrection are central to understanding their roles and functions within their respective mythologies. It is tempting to see a link in the names, since both come from Afro-Asiatic branches of language, but this is unclear. Eshmun is a deity from the Phoenician pantheon, primarily worshipped in the ancient cities of Damascus, Sidon, Tyre, and Beirut, as well as in the west, with temples in Carthage and Spain as well. He is recognized as the god of oil, healing, and medicine, often associated with the Greek god Asclepius, due to his similar healing attributes. Eshmun holds a significant place in Phoenician religion and mythology, embodying themes of fertility and resurrection, reflecting the interconnectedness of life and health in ancient Near Eastern cultures. Two Phoenician kings, Eshmun-Melqart, Eshmun-Melqart II, bear the name which translates literally as Eshmun saves. The name Eshmun in Phoenician comes from the Akkadian Yasamuni, which means oil, but also can be a pun and could mean the eighth, as the word shmoneh in Hebrew is 8, and shmon is oil. Interestingly, the Christ means to anoint with oil, and according to Hippolytus, the gematria of Jesus in Greek is 888. Even if that's a coincidence, it still should be noteworthy. One of the most notable myths involving Eshmun tells the story of his interaction with Astarte, the goddess of fertility, love, and war, who is equivalent to the Mesopotamian Ishtar and the Canaanite Anat. Astarte is one of the chief deities in the Phoenician pantheon, embodying the vigor and reproductive essence of nature. According to the myth, Astarte fell in love with the young beautiful hunter Eshmun, just as Ishtar falls in love with Tammuz, but more closely to Aphrodite, falling in love with Adonis, who was a mortal turned demigod. To escape the advances of Astarte, Eshmun fled and then, in his desperation to avoid her, castrated himself with a sword. This act led to his death, or in some variations, to his transformation into a god, specifically the god of healing. Astarte, grieved by the loss and moved by his act, then either resurrects him or assists in his transformation into a deity, solidifying his role as a god of health and healing. Like Adonis, Eshmun is a beautiful hunter in youth, adorned by Astarte Venus. Like Attis, Eshmun castrates himself and dies out of madness over the goddess. Like Tammuz and Osiris, Eshmun is mourned over by the goddess. And like Asclepius, Eshmun has the power to heal the sick and raise the dead. Damascius writes, "The Asclepius in Beirut is neither a Greek nor an Egyptian, but some native Phoenician divinity. For to Siddiq were born children who are interpreted as the Dioscuri or the Cabiori. In addition to these was born an eighth son, Eshmunus, who was interpreted as Asclepius." This passage by Damascius is backed up by a fragment from Philo of Byblos from the 1st century, who cites an even older text by Sanchoniatin that says that Eshmun is the son of the god Siddiq, which means righteous, a god who was identified with Apollo and or Jupiter. Siddiq was also the king of the gods, which means his name was literally Melchizedek, in other words, Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. This brings a whole new perspective and quite possibly some clarity on the order of Melchizedek, as Jesus is the new Melchizedek, the priest of Salem, who anoints Abraham and offers a Eucharist of bread and wine, even ending with Abraham tithing to Melchizedek. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Genesis 14. This also happens in Damascus, a city that was central to the rites of Siddiq and Eshmun. Photius, in Bibliotheca Codex 242, recounts Damascius' description of Asclepius of Beirut as a young hunting enthusiast like Adonis, the goddess Ashtaroth, often identified by scholars as a form of Astarte, became infatuated with him and pursued him so relentlessly that, out of sheer despair, he emasculates himself like Attis, leading to his death. And then Ashtaroth, moved by his plight, dubbed him a Paean, meaning healer, revived him, using her body's warmth, and transformed into a deity. This myth highlights several key themes in ancient Mediterranean Near Eastern mythology. such as the fluid boundaries between life and death, and the power of love and desire, and the process of transformation and transcendence from human to divine. In my opinion, these obscure yet precious primary sources about Eshmun serve as a missing link between the gods within the category of dying and rising gods of agriculture, who are venerated at the Spring Equinox before Jesus. Eshmun is a beautiful young hunter who is loved by the goddess of love, like Adonis and Venus. Eshmun is castrated after being pursued by the goddess, like Attis and Cybele, and Eshmun is returned from the dead and raised up by the powers of the goddess, like both Tammuz and Ishtar, or Osiris and Isis. The reason why I'm repeating these points again is because I can't stress enough how Eshmun's existence in the primary sources single-handedly should make the category of dying and rising gods a serious category that should not be abandoned anymore. He gives so much overlap to these gods that it can't be ignored. Not only that, but he is also worshipped in all major cities that are in walking distance to Nazareth. This proves that not only these dying and rising gods are connected to each other, but that people in Semitic-speaking cities in the Levant knew about these myths before the Gospels are written. Eshmun, like Attis, had his festival during the week of the Spring Equinox in Phoenician cities, in sync with the Hilaria and Adonia festivals, both which I will discuss shortly. Eshmun was also venerated in the city of Sidon, where a temple dedicated to him, known as the Kabur Eshmun, the tomb of Eshmun, has been discovered. The worship of Eshmun spread throughout the Phoenician colonies, including Carthage, indicating his importance within the Phoenician and Punic world. Devotees sought his aid for healing and protection from diseases, and his temples served as centers for healing rituals and the worship of the god. Like Asclepius, his temples were the ancient hospitals. The priests of Asclepius, the Greek Eshmun, were known as the Therapeutai. Therapeutai is a term that means to treat medically or service to the gods. Philo of Alexandria in the 1st century, in his book On the Contemplative Life, writes about a group of Therapeutai who he praises. Having mentioned the Essenes, who in all respects selected for their admiration and for their especial adoption of the practical course of life, and who excel in all, or what perhaps may be less unpopular and invidious thing to say, in most of its parts, I will now proceed in the regular order of my subject to speak about those who have embraced the speculative life. They are called Therapeutai and Therapeutides, to heal, either because they process an art of medicine more excellent than that in general use in cities, for that only heals bodies, but the other heals the souls, which are under the mastery of terrible and almost incurable diseases, which pleasures and appetites, fears and griefs, and covetousness and follies and injustice, and all the rest of the innumerable multitude of other passions and vices have inflicted on them, or else because they have been instructed by nature and the sacred laws to serve the living God. Philo associates the Jewish Essenes with the Greek Therapeutai. I also noticed that the name for the Essene in Hebrew is Eshim. Eshim, very closely related to the word Eshmun, and the etymology of the name is heavily disputed and unknown, some thinking that it's related to Hashaim, the silent ones, or Hase, pious. Some even suggesting Zenum, modest ones. However, given that Eshmun's temples were the places of healing and educated physicians, and Essenes are known to be healers, I think Eshim might very well be related to oil, and thus the Essenes could very well be connected to Eshmun. I also think it is plausible that the Therapeutai, along with the Greek Hypsisterians, who are Greek monotheists made up of Pythagoreans and Platonists, could very well be the proto-Christian Gnostics. Philo goes on to say this about the Therapeutae. Now this class of persons may be met within many places, for it was fitting that both Greece and the country of the barbarians should partake of whatever is perfectly good, and there is the greatest number of such men in Egypt. In every one of the districts, or nomes, as they are called, and especially around Alexandria, and from all corners, those who are the best of these Therapeutae proceed on their pilgrimage to some most suitable place, as if it were their country, which is beyond the Mareotic Lake. These Therapeutae were not just in Egypt, but were all over the nations, according to Philo. And since we can't really identify them outside of Philo's writings, then who exactly are they? As I've already suggested, the Gentile worshippers of Theos Hypsistos, God Most High, is certainly a candidate, but also, since they are healers and physicians, I think another place that we should look is the cult of Asclepius, also called Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, to where we get the symbol of medicine from. The biggest temples to Asclepius are the Asclepion at Pergamon in modern-day Turkey, right next to the second biggest library in the Roman Empire, and a hotspot for early Christianity, the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus, which Pausanias connected with the god Eshmun. Then you have the Serapeum in Egypt, which was considered sacred to Asclepius as well, since Serapis was a syncretic deity linked with Osiris, Asclepius, and Ion Plutonios. And then there is the Asclepion of Carthage, which is actually a temple dedicated to Eshmun-Melqart, a syncretic deity linked with Eshmun the physician, and Melqart, who is the Punic Heracles, another dying and rising deity, who I will get back to shortly. The 1st century AD pool of Bethesda, described in the Gospel of John, where Jesus heals a lame man in chapter 5, was found by archaeologists in 1964 to be a part of an Asclepion and a shrine dedicated to none other than Eshmun. A trilingual inscription from 2nd century BCE Sardinia, written in Latin, Greek, and Punic, also identifies Eshmun with the Greek Ophiuchus and the Latin Asclepius. Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, is the ancient 13th constellation that is on zodiacal ecliptic along with the other 12 traditional zodiac constellations of the Greeks and Babylonians. This constellation of Ophiuchus was that of a man holding a rod entwined with a serpent and standing on scorpions and snakes. This imagery seems to be apparent in Luke's Gospel as well. Behold, I give you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. In the book of Numbers, Moses held up a bronze rod with a serpent coiled around it that worked as a magic wand that could heal people from poisonous serpent bites. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and put it on a rod, and it shall come about that everyone who is bitten and looks at it will live." So Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on a rod, and it came about that if a serpent bit someone and he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. Numbers 21. This was also drawn from in the Gospel of John. When Jesus is on the cross, he is compared to the serpent on a cross in the wilderness. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, the Son of Man must also be lifted up. This passage would become central to some early Christian groups, such as the Nassenes, Ophites, and Sethians, who I shall touch on later when it's relevant. To the ancient Greeks, this constellation represented the god Apollo himself, struggling with a huge snake that guarded the Oracle of Delphi. Later myths identified Ophiuchus with Laocoon, the Trojan priest of Poseidon, who warned his fellow Trojans about the Trojan horse and was later slain by a pair of sea serpents sent by the gods to punish him. The Romans marked this constellation as the healer god Asclepius, Apollo's son, who learned the secrets of raising the dead, healing the sick, and keeping death at bay after observing one serpent bringing another healing herbs. To prevent the human race from becoming immortal under Asclepius' care, Jupiter killed him with a lightning bolt, but later raised him up into the heavens to honor his works as a god. The famous symbol shared by Asclepius, Eshmun, and Ophiuchus is the symbol of the serpent on the rod, the universal symbol for health and medicine. The priest of Eshmun, as well as Ophiuchus and Asclepius, would be the most educated class of priests, arguably on the entire planet during this time. The pre-Socratics, such as Parmenides and Pythagoras, who were not only well-known philosophers, but also poets, mathematicians, astronomers, biologists, skeptics, psychologists, and most of all, lawgivers. They were well-known worshippers of Apollo and his son Asclepius, and recent archaeology has shown that the schools of Parmenides and Pythagoras in southern Italy were deeply concerned with healing and medicines. In 1958, a series of archaeological discoveries were made in Velia in Italy, the Temple of Apollo, the center for the school of Parmenides. There was a statue that is among the most unique and rarest archaeological finds possibly of all time. The inscription at its base reads, Olus, son of Eukinos, healer, in the year 379. Two more similar inscriptions on statues were discovered. All three had the name Olus, but the fathers' names were different, Ariston and Hieronymus. The dates were also different, 280, 379, 446. Peter Kingsley, in his book Dark Places of Wisdom, goes in depth on the significance of these inscriptions, saying that the term Olus is associated with an individual devoted to Apollo and signifies a unique aspect of worship dedicated to Apollo Olios, particularly along Anatolia's western coastlines where the Ionians once dwelled, such as Pythagoras, Thales, Heraclitus, and Parmenides. The epithet Olios carries a nuanced duality. Initially, describes attitudes such as lethal, harmful, or severe, acknowledging the darker aspects inherent in every deity. However, the Greeks also interpreted Oulios to mean the one who restores to health. This duality encapsulates Apollo's essence, simultaneously the healer and the destroyer, embodying the capacity to both inflict and cure. Apollyon in Greek means to destroy, but Apollo is a god of healing and restoration. Peter Kingsley has this to say in his book, Dark Places of Wisdom. You find that to them heroes weren't just figures in some mythical past. For them, the heroic ideal is something that had to be lived in the present. The aim of one's life, the life of a wise man, was to follow the way of the hero to live his ordeals, his sufferings, his transformation. That's what provided the spiritual purpose and the map of their existence. You can still see how this imitation of the hero was adapted by Christianity to become the imitation of Christ. Kingsley, one of the great classicists and historians of our time, writes that these very Velians, from the school of Parmenides and Pythagoreans from the school of Croton, all who can technically be considered religious Orphics, built temples to Apollo in the southern coast of Italy, and at these places they conducted rituals of medically induced incubation. Parmenides set up a temple in Velia where the rites of incubation were performed, and the initiates would spend days or even weeks in a dark cave under the supervision of a magus and report his dreams to them for conducting research. It all sounds bizarre, but this was early science in the ancient world. They compared these rituals with the myths of Orpheus descending into the underworld to perform his music in the presence of the king and queen of Hades in order that he may raise his dead wife from the grave. Pythagoras, departing his native Samos in Ionia, lived in Egypt for 12 years, and then Babylon for another 12 years. Finally, after 24 years of education amongst the Chaldeans and Magi, he set sail for Italy, carried with him the traditions of the advanced Persian and Egyptian knowledge, including methods of incubation and practices for journeying to the underworld, demonstrating his deep reverence for the underworld goddess Persephone, who descended and returned from Hades. He transformed his new residence at Croton, Italy, into a medical sanctuary in the name of Apollo, showcasing his devotion. The ritual Katabasis was no longer just mythology. This was reality to them. Xenophanes, student of Pythagoras in southern Italy, taught that God is one, supreme among gods and men, and not like men either in mass or mind. We can see the obvious roots of Judeo-Christian thought within the fragments of these pre-Socratic Orphics.
A oneness of being that is uncreated, unbegotten, alone begotten, whole, unmoved, unending, indestructible, homogeneous, continuous, contiguous, that it abides in one position, is indivisible, has always been as it is, and never can be any different.
These are Orphic, Peripatetic, Platonist, and Pythagorean philosophers who are also trained in medicine and history, as well as religious matters. Pyrrho, the founder of philosophical skepticism, traveled with Alexander the Great to Babylon and India, and engaged with the brightest minds from the Brahmins, Buddhists, as well as the Magi, and brought these ideas back to Egypt for the newly built Library of Alexandria. It is not impossible, in my opinion, and it's actually likely that Christianity draws some of its influence from Buddhist and Taoist thought via Pyrrhonism and the Therapeutae in Egypt, who adopt these ideas in the melting pot that is Alexandria, Egypt. Not only was there Buddhist temples in Alexandria, Egypt, but we also know that Ashoka the Great, king of India in the 3rd century BCE, set up pillars of India to Asia Minor and Egypt and as far as Greece. And on these pillars, he inscribed a Buddhist and globalist message to the leaders to allow for universal health care, for free trade, and forward thinking among the educated classes in these areas. These Ashoka pillars mention Ptolemy, Antiochus, and Antigonus by name. 500 BCE, hurt not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful, from the Buddha. 300 BCE, that which you hate to be done to you, do not to another, Egyptian papyri. 10 BCE, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Hillel the Elder, the golden rule that many credit to Jesus of Nazareth, was already well established as universal wisdom, dating back to the early Iron Age, found in Greek and Hindu text. It is these very philosophers and healers who, I think, become the philosophical sect called the Therapeutae, and these Therapeutae are the proto-Christian Gnostics. Even Christian church fathers claim to be descended from the Therapeutae. In ecclesiastical history, Eusebius of Caesarea, a Christian writer from the 3rd century, referred to Philo's Therapeutae as the predecessors of Christian monasticism. He highlighted their practices, such as giving up possessions, embracing chastity, observing fasts, and leading solitary lives as parallel to the communal living ideals of Christian monks. Epiphanius of Salamis, a 4th century bishop, labeled Philo's Therapeutae as part of the Christian community in his work, Panarion. A 5th century author, Pseudo-Dionysius, also drawing on Philo's descriptions, suggested that the ascetics were known as Therapeutae, or servants, while others referred to them as monks, he viewed Philo's group as a structured Christian ascetic community, interpreting therapeutai to mean servants. The Gnostic sects of the Valentinians, Nassenes, Carpocratians, and Simonians deeply venerate the pre-Socratic wisdom of the Greeks and Eastern wisdom of the Magi. The Nassenes and Ophites, for example, thought of Christ as the serpent on the cross, which is the symbol of the physician common to the Greek therapeutai and the Semitic cult of Eshmun. The cult of Eshmun, like that of other Phoenician deities, was influenced by and intertwined with the religious practices of neighboring cultures, leading to syncretism with gods from Greek, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian pantheons. This syncretism reflects the dynamic and interconnected nature of ancient Mediterranean religious practices, where deities could embody similar themes across different cultures while retaining unique aspects within their original contexts. For example, in Cyprus, Eshmun was syncretized with Melqart, and also Ibiza is given by a dedication reciting, "To his lord Eshmun-Melqart." Melqart is the Punic Heracles, who is also a dying and rising deity, venerated at the Spring Equinox. Shocker, I know. At this point, you must be thinking this is getting out of control, with all these sons or daughters of God dying and resurrecting at Easter time. Either I'm lying and making all this up, or your favorite seminarian Bible scholar has a lot of explaining to do, and I implore you to fact check everything I'm saying. I also am not even close to being done yet. There is overwhelming data to support that Melqart, like Osiris, Tammuz, Romulus, Ishtar, Eshmun, Attis, Adonis, Persephone, Huankinthos, Orpheus, and Dionysus, is a dying and rising or Katabasis hero who is venerated at the Spring Equinox. The peer-reviewed book, Phoenicians and the West, Politics, Colonies, and Trade, by Professor of Archaeology Maria Eugenia Aubet, states, Melqart played the central role in the Phoenician Spring Festival, during which he died and was resurrected, an annual festival during the same week as Easter, Passover, and Roman Hilaria, was the annual spring celebration of Melqart's resurrection. This is supported by Josephus, who also cites Menander of Ephesus, saying he also went down and cut down materials of timber out of the mountain called Lebanon for the roof of the temples. And when he had pulled down the ancient temples, he both built the temples of Heracles, Eshmun-Melqart, and that of Ishtar. And he was the first to celebrate the resurrection of Heracles in the month of Peritius. Josephus uses the Greek word egersis for Heracles, which is the same word Matthew uses for resurrection of Jesus. Meta 10, egersin, to aselthin, and coming out of the graves after his resurrection, egersis, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. The Christian scholars who translated Josephus went out of their way to not use the word resurrection for Heracles, and instead use the word awaken, when resurrection is the correct word to be used here. Pathetic. Welcome to seminarian Bible scholarship, where more work goes into hiding things than revealing them. Also, Josephus does use the name for Heracles. However, the temple in Phoenicia was dedicated to Melqart, who was fully synced with the healer Eshmun by the late 1st century. Eshmun was clearly a syncretic god passed down from Assyrian Bel and synced with Ophiuchus in Phoenicia, and was venerated in the Levant from the 7th century BCE to the 5th century of the Common Era. Evidence of pilgrimages to his temple from all over the Roman Empire lasted up until the Christian era in the 4th century, and severing coins of Eshmun are minted in Syria and Lebanon in the 3rd century. Eshmun is synced not only with Melqart, but also with Adonis and Attis. If you are wondering if there is actual textual evidence or primary sources from early Christians in the late 1st and early 2nd century that acknowledge that these dying and rising gods are linked with Jesus in any way? The answer is yes, but I will get to those texts at the very end, because there are things that need to be discussed before that is shown. The Pyrgi tablets are 3 golden leaves dating back to the 5th century BCE, discovered in 1964 during excavations at the ancient Etruscan port city of Pyrgi, Italy. They are significant for several reasons, primarily because they offer a rare example of bilingual text from the ancient world. 2 of the tablets are inscribed in Etruscan, and the 3rd is in Phoenician, providing valuable insights into the languages and the interaction between the Etruscans and Phoenicians. The tablets were dedicated to the Phoenician god Astarte, consort of Eshmun, and are believed to have been part of a ceremonial offering made by Theferi Velianus, the king of Caere, the Etruscan city controlling Pyrgi at the time, making a dedication to the goddess. This is indicated by the inscriptions which detail the offering and consecration made by Velianus to Astarte. Astarte, who is Lady Babylon, or Ishtar, who has been talked about at length in this video, makes her mark on Rome all the way back in the days of the Etruscans. The significance of the Pyrgi tablets offers insights into the religious practices, diplomatic relations, and cultural exchanges between the Etruscan and Phoenician people. Furthermore, the Pyrgi tablets shed light on the extent of the Phoenician influence in the Mediterranean and the interconnectedness of the ancient Mediterranean cultures. They are among the most important archaeological finds related to the Etruscans, a civilization that played a significant role in the history of ancient Italy, but left behind relatively few written records. They also show how we can see Eshmun in one inscription can be Adonis or Attis in the other inscriptions, while the goddess Astarte becomes Venus. This is an early demonstration of Romani interpretatio, where different languages tell nearly identical myths but transfer the names of gods within their pantheons. The Phoenician text of the Pyrgi tablets, Western Italy, seem to indicate commemoration of the death of Adonis was an important rite in central Italy as far back as 500 BCE. The Phoenician phrase, Bim Kabir Alim, on the day of burial of the divinity, refers to this rite. Then, the phrase, the death of the handsome Adonis. Prime example, Adonis is another god whose death and resurrection was celebrated at the spring. Ritual mourning for Adonis was widespread from Phoenicia to Greece. As we mentioned in the beginning of the video, the mourning for Tammuz by Ishtar was a famous Sumerian poem recited during the Akitu Festival. Sappho, the famous poet from Lesbos, who lived all the way back in the 7th century BCE, even before the Persians defeated the Assyrians, wrote this famous poem.
Cytherea, thy dainty Adonis is dying. Ah, what shall we do? O nymphs, let it echo, the voice of your crying, the greenwood through. O forest maidens, smite on the breast, rend ye the delicate woven vest. Let the well ring wild and high. Ah, for Adonis! Cry, O Sappho, how canst thou chant the bliss of Kypris after such day as this? O Adonis, thou leavest me, woe for my lot, and Eros, my servant, availeth me not. So wails Cytherea, grief distraught. Who shall console me for thee? There is none. Not Ares, my god-lover, passionate one, who sware in his jealousy forth to hell. Hephaestus, my spouse, from his palace, if he dared but to lift his eyes unto me. Not he can console me, Adonis, for thee. Well for Adonis, well. A Lament for Adonis, Sappho, 600 BCE.
The obvious parallels to Ishtar and Tammuz go without saying. Just like Eshmun, Adonis was a beautiful hunter who was loved by Venus, and as he is hunting, he is killed by a wild boar, who in some versions of the myth say that it's Mars in disguise, who seeks to get revenge on Adonis for taking Venus away from him. Venus mourns over the death of Adonis, and her tears mix with the blood of Adonis, which causes a rose to grow from the ground, marking his divinity and annual agricultural rise from the dead. The famous Augustan-era poet Ovid retells this famous ancient story in Latin in the Metamorphoses, written about 20 BCE. The Adonia Festival was celebrated at 2 times of the year, first in the early spring at the Vernal Equinox, and then at the midsummer solstice. Aristophanes, in his Lysistrata, has the festival take place in the early spring of 415 BCE, when the Sicilian expedition was proposed. Throughout the festival, Athenian women ascended to their rooftops, where they engaged in dancing, singing, and ritual lamentation for the death of Adonis. They cultivated Adonis's gardens by planting lettuce and fennel seeds in the broken pots, observing them quickly sprouting and then perish. Following the rooftop festivities, the women carried these miniature gardens and diminutive figures of Adonis down the streets, where they stage a symbolic funeral procession. This culminated ceremonial interment of the effigies and the wilted gardens, either in the ocean or natural springs. In Theocritus' 15th Idyll, dated to the 4th century BCE, we find the most extensive account of the Adonia festival that's been preserved to this very day. This depiction by Theocritus showcases a version of the festival that enjoyed official support from the court of Ptolemy and included a yearly contest where women performed mournful songs for Adonis. The historian Pausanias in the 2nd century mentions that women in Argos commemorated Adonis and dedicated a shrine to him. Lucian's On the Syrian Goddess details an Adonia festival in Byblos during the same century. Here in Byblos, the river Adonis turns red each year during the spring due to heavy rainfall washing off the red oily rock that sits above the river in the mountains, making the river of Adonis bleed red with the blood of the god. In Roman times, Adonis and Osiris are synced together as the god Plutonios Ion, a central deity within the Mithraic Mysteries who was in direct competition with Christianity, and his festival was celebrated in the same week as Attis, known as the Hilaria Festival, which took place between March 22nd and April 1st. The Hilaria Festival is the most interesting of all the Spring Equinox festivals. This festival, adopted by the Romans in 204 BCE, has its roots back in ancient Phrygia, central to the Great Mother Cybele and her consort Attis. The myth of Attis is a lot like Eshmun's story. Attis was the ancient Phrygian god of vegetation and the consort of the Great Mother of the gods, Cybele. The goddess drove him into a mad frenzy, which caused him to castrate himself, just like Eshmun. He then bleeds out and dies, just like Eshmun. But Cybele raises him up into a god and places him as an eternal tree that buds each year during the spring. There are other versions of the myth, which include Attis being raised by milk of he-goats, but instead of Cybele, it's a hermaphroditic god called Aegisthus who loves him instead. Attis still castrates himself in this version and dies, but Aegisthus repented of what she had done to Attis and persuaded Zeus to grant the body of Attis to neither rot nor decay. And in this version, Attis lives forever, immortal, in his flesh. Initiates of the eunuch priesthood of Cybele, known as the Galloi, same titles as the eunuchs of Ishtar, reenacted this myth with an act of self-castration each year during what is known as the Holy Week of Attis, celebrated roughly during the same week as Easter, which is right now, if you are watching this video brand new. The Hilaria of Attis was a Holy Week, or the Passion of Attis. This was a Roman festival, celebrated in multiple cities in Rome during the same week, and in Egypt was celebrated for Osiris and Isis, without castration though, and slightly celebrated differently. But this was still called the Hilaria, which means in Latin, rejoicing. Violets and wreaths were used to decorate the Roman tombs. Arnobius of Sicca preserved the entire calendar of the Holy Week of Attis, known as Hilaria. On March 15th, the Cana Intra, the reed enters, the Canaphori, reed bearers, march in a procession, marking the birth of Attis. During this time, followers of Magna Mater abstained from bread, pomegranates, quinces, fish, and pork. On March 22nd, the tree enters. The Dendrophori, the tree bearers, carry a pine tree wrapped in wool, decked with violets in a funeral procession. This marked the death of Attis. They also decorated the tree, and tiny figures of the god Attis were placed on top. The day of mourning and fasting, the pine tree is laid to rest at the Temple of Magna Mater on March 23rd. The next day was the Day of Blood. The devotees of Attis and Cybele whipped themselves to offer their blood to the gods. Meanwhile, the Gali, priest of Cybele, would play flutes and beat hand drums. Then Attis was placed in his tomb. The next day would call the Day of Rejoicing. March 25th, Attis or Osiris is resurrected. People staged street carnivals to celebrate. The next day, March 26th, was the Day of Rest. After the previous day's fun, people rested. Finally, on March 27th, the Day of Washing, the sacred stone of Magna Mater was carried down the Appian Way to Almo in Rome, a tributary of the Tiber. The goddess was washed with ashes and showered with violets. One of the earliest sects of Christianity that is mentioned in the primary sources, known as the Nassenes, and were said to have synced Jesus with not only Attis, but with a whole lot of the dying and rising gods. Hippolytus, in his On Heresies, addresses a man called the Nasseene preacher, who he claims was singing hymns that were originally written for Attis, but applying them to Jesus. Here's what the hymn to Jesus says: "Whether you are Kronos' offspring, or that of Zeus, O Blessed One, or of Rhea, be greeted, the Great One, at the sound of whose name Rhea cast down her eyes, O Jesus Christ. The Assyrians call you thrice beloved Adonis, all of Egypt Osiris. Hellenic wisdom, the horn of men upon heaven. The Samothracians, august Adonis, unconquered one. The Haemonians, Thessalians, Corybas, and the Phrygians, sometimes Pappus. The other times, corpse, God, unfruitful one, goat herd, ear of grain while still green, fruitful one, whom the almond bore, the man who plays the pipe. I shall hymn Rhea's Attis, not with the chiming of bells, or with the bellowing of the flute of the Idaean Caretes mingled with it. Rather, I shall mix lyre playing with my Phobian muse. Ewo, hallelujah, Ewan, you are Pan, Bacchus, as a shepherd of the white stars, Jesus Christ." So just to sum this up for you, during the same week as Easter, you have a festival that celebrates the death and resurrection of Attis and Osiris, including a day of mourning, followed 2 days later by a day of rejoicing, the same 3-day sequence of death and resurrection of Jesus at Easter. And on the top of that, you have early pre-church Christians who are singing hymns that equate Jesus with these exact deities. And still, many New Testament scholars think this is just a coincidence and has no influence on the gospel stories. The Greek tale of Aphrodite's love for the youth Anchises on Mount Ida in the Troad was probably also loosely derived from the myth of Attis, also drawn from Adonis and Tammuz as well. Attis was also identified by the Greeks with the god Iasios, the consort of the Great Mother in the Samothracian Mysteries. Iasios is another god who dies by the hands of Zeus by a thunderbolt for laying in a field with Demeter, but is also able to get her pregnant with twins, Plutos and Triptolemus, gods central to the Eleusinian Mysteries, who spread the rites of Dionysus to the world. Some sources even suggest that Plutos and Triptolemus are both secret avatars of the god Dionysus himself, as both share an epithet with him, which is Iacchos, an epithet only shared by Dionysus and their mother Demeter, a possible clue to the esoteric truth about Iasios and Demeter. Dionysus is the most important and elaborate of all the gods who die and resurrect. Among all Greek deities, Dionysus stands out as the most beloved, yet hardest to categorize. Dionysus is one of the oldest gods from pre-Hellenic times, and before the Greek alphabet even existed, originating from Thrace, where he was initially revered as Sabazius, the barley, beer deity. In Greece, he transformed into a god of the grapevine and fruits, overseeing and nurturing vineyards, evolving from a fertility god to a deity of ecstasy, divine inspiration, and mania, and ultimately becoming a divine figure who sacrifices himself for humanity. Dionysus' mythology is a rich blend of various characters and tales, notably including the identification as Zagreus, the horned child of Zeus and Persephone, favored by Zeus and chosen to be the heir of heaven. Dionysus was tragically targeted by Hera's jealousy, leading to a dramatic and brutal death at the hands of the Titans, dismembered, only to be resurrected by Zeus, thanks to Athena's intervention and Zeus's ingenuity. When Dionysus returns, he once again conquers death by being able to descend into Hades and successfully return with the poet Aeschylus, who he raises up and makes divine. No other god achieves both resurrection and katabasis in the same timeline other than Dionysus and Jesus. The worship of Dionysus was marked by elaborate rituals that celebrated his death and resurrection, drawing vast numbers of Greeks into the wilderness each spring, known as the Great Dionysia, celebrated at Athens and Thebes from the 10th to the 16th of the month of Epipholia, which corresponds exactly to the month of Nisan, which means, once again, another festival of death and resurrection that overlaps with Easter, and the attendants of the Dionysia would revel in the rebirth of nature and the god himself. These celebrations involve uninhibited drinking, ecstatic dances, and wild processions led by maenads. The rituals culminated in the symbolic dismemberment of a creature, mirroring Dionysus' own fate, to achieve a profound communion, believed to unite the participants with divine. Dionysus's cult, with its intense and mystical rites, swept through Greece, challenging the conventional worship of the Olympian gods. Despite attempts by religious and political authorities to contain its influence, Dionysus was eventually embraced within the Olympian fold, his worship formalized into the Great Dionysia at the Vernal Equinox of springtime. This integration marked a significant shift, blending Dionysian ecstasy with more structured worship of gods like Apollo. Speaking of Apollo, there is another god who dies and rises at the spring, and that is Apollo's male lover, Huankinthos. In fact, Huankinthos and Apollo are so old that they are considered by scholars to be pre-Hellenic, Bronze Age gods that trace back to the Mycenaeans. Huankinthos, a Spartan prince, noted for his extraordinary beauty, captured the affection of the god Apollo. Apollo's love for Huankinthos was so intense that he left his Delphi sanctuary to spend the time with him at the Euphrates River, where he shared with Huankinthos skills in archery, music, prophecy, and athletic training. During a lesson in quote throwing, a friendly match ensued where they took turns throwing the discus. Apollo's throw was so powerful, it cleaved the clouds. Huankinthos, eager to catch the discus, ran after it, but it ricocheted on the ground, striking his head and inflicting a mortal wound. As Apollo cradled his expiring lover, his complexion grew ashen. He attempted every remedy, from various herbs to offering ambrosia, in a vain effort to mend Huankinthos' injuries. Yet, he was powerless against the destiny of fates that had been decreed. Overcome with grief for Huankinthos, Apollo yearned to shed his divinity and share in the young Spartan's mortal fate, even pleading with his uncle, Hades, to end his life. He created a flower from Huankinthos' spilled blood, the Huankinth, as inscribed on its petals the words of lamentation, alas. The flower Huankinth turned into the modern plant bearing its name. Huankinthos was eventually resurrected by Apollo and attained immortality. Pausanias has recorded that the throne of Apollo in Sparta had the depiction of a bearded Huankinthos being taken to heaven along with Polyboa by Aphrodite, Athena, and Artemis. Huankinthos personifies the sprouting vegetation in spring, which is killed by the heat of the summer. The apotheosis of Huankinthos indicates that, after attaining godhood, he represented the natural cycle of decay and renewal. Greek religion accompanied three main phases: the Chthonian or earthbound, the Olympian, and the mystical, each reflecting different societal classes and periods. The mystical aspect embodied in the secret rites, promise, personal immortality, becoming a vital part of Greek spirituality. The Eleusinian Mysteries, centered around Demeter and Persephone's myth, were paramount among these rites, symbolizing death and rebirth in a grand cycle of life that offered hope for an afterlife filled with joy and peace. This ancient promise of renewal, merged with Egyptian concepts of the afterlife, laid the spiritual groundwork for Christianity's rise in the Western world. Remember when I told you earlier in the video to remember the good looks playboy sent by Enki to charm the queen of the underworld, Ereshkigal? Enter Orpheus, the good looks playboy who lost his beloved wife, Eurydice, and travels down into Hades, where he plays his lyre in front of the queen of the underworld, Persephone, and his charm and magic of his song sways her to allow him to return from Hades and bring his wife with him. In the 7th century BCE, when Greece was profoundly influenced by a mystical cult more impactful than the Eleusinian Mysteries, tracing its roots back to Orpheus, a legendary Thracian bard known for his unparalleled cultural, musical, and poetic talents, as noted by Diodorus. Orpheus, a symbol of gentleness, musical mastery, and deep emotion, captivated all of creation with his lyre, taming wild beasts and moving inanimate nature with his melodies. His tragic love story with Eurydice, which led him to the underworld in an attempt to reclaim her, only to lose her again due to a moment of doubt, adds a poignant layer to this myth. His reluctance to find solace in others after Eurydice's final loss angered Thracian women, who in a Dionysian frenzy tore him apart, with Zeus immortalizing Orpheus's lyre in the stars, and his still singing head becomes a revered oracle in Lesbos, symbolizing Orpheus's immortality after death and being raised up by Zeus into the heavens. Between Orpheus's love for Eurydice and Apollo's love for Zakynthos, there's a message there beneath both of these stories. It's that, to be resurrected, it's the people behind in the world that you leave when you die that resurrect your soul through them remembering you. Orpheus was believed to have left behind sacred hymns, later organized by Onomacritus, the Orphic theologian, who was also credited for compiling the writings of Musaeus, the son of Orpheus, who some thought could be the same person as Moses, who left behind a text known as the Pentateuch, including kresmoi, oracles, written similar to the compilation of the Homeric epics and Homeric hymns. These oracles and hymns laid the foundation for the Orphic cult, which emphasized the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, particularly through the lens of Dionysius Zagreus's narrative. This belief system introduced concepts of original sin, divine redemption into Greek thought, portraying the soul as trapped within the body, a prison or tomb, but also containing a spark of divinity from Dionysus himself. The Orphic rituals, particularly the sacraments of eating a bowl symbolizing Dionysus, the body and bread of the Eucharist symbolizing the blood and body of Dionysus, were meant to reaffirm this connection to the divine. Orphic theology provided a detailed account of the soul's journey after death, facing judgment in the underworld, with outcomes ranging from eternal damnation to rebirth through the cycle of transmigration, depending on the soul's purity. This complex eschatology, which also allowed for penances and indulgences, influenced Plato's critique of religious practices in Athens and sowed the seeds for the concepts of sin, redemption, and the afterlife that would permeate later religious doctrines. Orphism introduced a moral and aesthetic dimension to Greek religion, advocating of a lifestyle distinct from hedonistic worship of the Olympian gods and turning to piety. This movement, which likely influenced Pythagoreanism and contributed to Platonic and Stoic thought, set the stage for Christian morals, monasticism, and mysticism, echoing the dualistic view of body and soul, the pursuit of purity, and the hope for immortality. The Orphic legacy, with its rich symbols, rituals, beliefs, continues to resonate, underscoring the enduring human quest for meaning and transcendence beyond the tangible world. The ancient concept of the Katabasis refers to a descent, especially a journey down into the underworld or a significant trip to a lower realm. This term is deeply rooted in classical mythology and literature, symbolizing a hero's journey to the land of the dead. Such a narrative often involves a hero confronting supernatural challenges, meeting with the souls of the departed, or seeking wisdom and power that is unattainable in the mortal world. Katabasis is a recurring theme in various ancient cultures, but is particularly prominent in Greek and Roman mythology. Examples include Orpheus' journey to the underworld to retrieve his wife Eurydice, showcasing his attempt to overcome death with the power of music and love, only to tragically lose her again by violating the condition of not looking back until reaching the surface. There is also Heracles, who is one of the earliest pre-Hellenic gods to have completed the Katabasis. Heracles, in one of the 12 labors, specifically when he had to capture Kerberos, the three-headed dog guarding the entrance to Hades, demonstrating his strength and courage, he enters Hades and returns triumphantly. When Euripides tells the tale about Heracles, he specifically recounts a 3-day sequence showing the same 3-day motif for Jesus during Easter weekend.
Admetus. Now wherefore speechless standeth thus my wife? Hercules. 'Tis not vouchsafed thee yet to hear her voice, ere to the powers beneath the earth she be unconsecrated, and the 3rd day come. But lead her in, and just man as thou art, henceforth, Admetus, reverence still the guest. Farewell, but I must go and work the work set by the king, the son of Sthenelus.
In Euripides' Alcestis, there lies a thread of ancient ritual and celestial decree. Alcestis must linger in a state of liminality until the 3rd day to be released from her consecration to the chthonic powers, these enigmatic deities of the underworld. This period of waiting, steeped in mysticism and ancient Greek religious practice, symbolizes a necessary transition, a sort of purgatorial interlude where the boundary between life and death blurs. It's a time when Alcestis, though reclaimed from the clutches of Hades by Heracles' valor, must yet navigate the shadowy corridors of the afterlife before she can step back into the sunlit world of the living. This waiting period is not just a pause in the narrative, it's a sacred interval, deeply rooted in the cultural and spiritual ethos of Euripides' timeline, reflecting a profound respect for the rites and rituals that govern the passage between the worlds. Besides Orpheus and Heracles, there are dozens of other heroes and gods who perform the Katabasis. Odysseus' visit to the underworld in Homer's Odyssey to seek advice from the prophet Tiresias, offering insights into his future challenges and the fate of his companions. He is able to travel into the land of the dead and return unharmed. Aeneas' descent to the underworld in Virgil's Aeneid, guided by the Cumaean Sibyl to meet his deceased father Anchises, who reveals Rome's glorious future, symbolizing the foundation of Roman identity and destiny. One of Aeneas' descendants, Romulus, according to Livy, was the founder of Rome, established greatness for the new city against the Sabine tribes, but was murdered by his foes in a brutal way. When they went to look for his body, Romulus, like Jesus, had disappeared and was raised up by Jupiter, and according to Livy, was placed at the right hand of Jupiter, and later returned to his followers on Earth. Persephone is another character who completes the Katabasis. She is taken down to Hades by Pluto against her will, though, but due to her mother Demeter's relentless pursuit, is able to return for 6 months each year. These stories were not merely adventurous tales, but carried deeper meanings. Katabasis represented a rite of passage, a transformation that allowed the hero to gain profound knowledge, resolve, and sometimes divine favor, crucial for completing their quest or fulfilling their destinies. It has also reflected ancient beliefs about death, afterlife, and the connection between the living and the dead, embodying themes of loss, redemption, and the eternal cycle of life and death. It was believed and well established within Christian tradition that while Jesus was dead during the weekend between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, that his soul descended into the underworld, into hell or Hades, where he preached the good word of salvation to the souls in hell, and that they raised up with him in his glory when he ascended to the Father. This is the Katabasis in the most fundamental sense. In the lore of ancient Greece, the tales of Orpheus, Dionysus, Persephone, Heracles, Odysseus, Psyche, Aeneas, and Romulus embarking on perilous journeys to the underworld, known as Hades, and making their return to the above world. These adventures, termed Katabasis for the descent and the Anabasis return, are thought to symbolize the rites of passage of the mystery cults, especially those held in Eleusis for 2 millennia. While clear to the ancients, the symbolic meaning of these myths has become obscure over time. These myths and the Eleusinian Mysteries they hint at taught concepts of life after death, rebirth, and the eternal soul, influencing early Christian thought and rhetoric. The mysteries began in Eleusis, initiated by Demeter in her search for her daughter Persephone, leading to a myth that explains the cycle of the seasons and the dual role of Persephone as the queen of the underworld and the embodiment of spring's return. The rituals of the Eleusinian Mysteries, shrouded in secrecy under penalty of death for divulgence, began with purification and fasting, following the processions and sacrifices, culminating in symbolic reenactment of the soul's journey through death to a higher state of existence. This series of rites promised initiates a deeper understanding of life's mysteries, including the afterlife's reward and punishments. Before the fall festivities, initiates underwent a spring ceremony for the lesser mysteries, involving purification and learning of sacred myths. The greater mysteries unfolded in autumn, initiates experiencing symbolic death and rebirth through stage rituals in darkness, confronting fears and emerging into light. A transformation underscored by the consumption of a sacred drink made up of wine and barley, and the utterance of a mystic phrase. The highest level of initiation revealed through an allegory of agricultural rebirth, bestowed upon the initiate the title of epithes or seer, marking a profound spiritual awakening. This connection to the mysteries of life, death, and rebirth resonated with the philosophical and theological currents of the time, suggesting early monotheistic tendencies and a belief in the soul's immortality after death. These ancient rituals and their encoded wisdom found echoes in early Christianity, which adapted and expanded upon these themes to reach a wider audience familiar with the language and symbols of the mystery cults. The teachings of the Eleusinian Mysteries, with their emphasis on moral improvement and the hope of a blessed afterlife, thus provided a fertile ground for the spread of Christian doctrine, blending ancient rites with the new religious insights. In essence, the Eleusinian Mysteries and the mythic journeys of Greek heroes offers a window into the ancient world's spiritual beliefs and the continuity of these themes into the Christian era, underscoring the universal quest for understanding the mysteries of life, death, and the divine. Cicero's praise for the Eleusinian Mysteries as a civilizing force reflects the enduring value of these ancient rites in shaping human thought and spirituality, echoing through a history as a testament to the power of sacred tradition to inspire hope and moral growth. Justin Martyr, who lived in the middle of the 2nd century, knew that these Greek myths had much overlap with Jesus in the Gospels.
Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, said, "This do in remembrance of me. This is my body." And that after the same manner, having taken the cup and given thanks, he said, "This is my blood," and gave it to them alone, which the wicked devils have imitated in the mysteries of Mithras, commanding the same thing to be done. For that bread and a cup of water are placed with certain incantations in the mystic rites of one who is being initiated. You either know or can learn. Justin Martyr, Apology.
You see, Justin Martyr had no choice but to deal with these other non-Christian myths, since there was no seminarians around to gaslight everyone into thinking that there is no pre-Christian influence outside of the Hebrew Bible. So, what does he do here to try to get around the obvious fact that Christianity is borrowing motifs and religious themes from other mythologies? He claims that demons created these myths in anticipation of Christ, so that people will fall into their trap. This is so absurd, but I thank him for leaving this behind so we can now demonstrate the truth.
The devils, accordingly, when they heard these prophetic words, said that Bacchus was the son of Jupiter, and gave out that he was the discoverer of the vine. And they number wine, or the ass, among his mysteries. And they taught that, having been torn in pieces, he ascended into heaven. Justin Martyr, Apology.
And Justin Martyr was not alone in this thinking. Arnobius, in his Against the Pagans, makes a similar argument, as does Firmicus Maternus in his book Error of the Pagan Religions.
Rock-born Mithra versus Christ the Rock. Another pagan sacrament has the keyword theos, ek petros, God from a rock. Why do you adulterate the faith and transfer this holy and worshipful mystery to pagan doings? Firmicus Maternus, Error of the Pagans.
Too bad that these myths predate the Gospels by a matter of centuries. Both Firmicus and Justin Martyr give dozens of examples of pagan myths that sound similar to the Gospels, thinking that they can argue against these myths by arguing that devils predicted the Gospels in order to fool people, not realizing that by writing this, they just walked into their own punches, and anyone with a brain can see how backwards this is. Church historian Eusebius of Caesarea in 325 CE wrote an entire book called Preparatio Evangelio that argues that many ancient writings from the pagan Gentile world were just as much prophetic as the writings from the Old Testament, citing Phoenician mythology, Zoroastrian texts, Egyptian texts, as well as Plato, and the Greek philosophers who he thinks were all pointing to Christ. But it is obvious to me that the Gospels are just drawing back from them, which is probably why apologists don't use those arguments anymore. They are better off just pretending they don't exist, like we see today in New Testament scholarship. In a letter from 395 AD, Jerome, a prominent church father, notes that Bethlehem, which is now under our care, once covered by a grove dedicated to Tammuz or Adonis, and the very cave that echoed with the cries of the newborn Christ, was previously a place where the consort of Venus was mourned. This cave was subsequently transformed into the location of the Church of the Nativity. We know from old letters from St. Pope Gregory that it was church policy to repurpose old pagan temples and sprinkle holy water in them to convert them to churches. But this one, the place where Jesus was claimed to be born, is the same location for the grove dedicated to Tammuz and Adonis. Seems too on the money, given everything we already discussed in this video. Syrian authors Jacob of Seru and Romanos the Melodist composed elegies portraying the Virgin Mary's sorrow for her son at the crucifixion, expressing her grief in intimate language that mirrors Ishtar's mourning for Tammuz. In the 6th century AD, certain early Christians in the Middle East adapted aspects of Ishtar's lamentations for Tammuz into their narratives of the Virgin Mary grieving over the demise of her son, Jesus. Let me know what you think in the comments. You have just attained true gnosis.